Welcome to another installment of our expert series. The CDA Institute recently sat down with Michael Kugelman. Michael is the writer of Foreign Policy's weekly South Asia Brief. He's also the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center in Washington. Michael and I discussed the war in Ukraine and its impact on East Asian and Indo-Pacific security. Kugelman also explains India's position on the conflict and dives into India and Russia's relationship. He discusses the recent Quad summit as well as how U.S. allies perceive the likelihood of a similar conflict over Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific. Michael, it's great to have you today. Thanks for taking time to speak with the CDA Institute. To start, I'd like to get your perspective on how U.S. allies and partners in South Asia have responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How do countries throughout the region perceive the likelihood of a similar conflict in Asia, and to what extent are nations in the region prepared to respond to such a conflict?
I would argue that the responses within the South Asian countries to the invasion of Ukraine have been quite striking for their muted nature. Certainly, we've talked a lot about how a fair amount of the world has united in support of this idea of confronting and pushing back against Russia for what it did in Ukraine. But in South Asia, you've got 8 countries in South Asia, and half of them, 4 of them, abstained from that UN General Assembly resolution condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's striking that South Asia is a region where Russia does not have any enemies, and it has quite a few friends. So we know about the very deep relationship between India and Russia, but other countries, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, all have varying degrees of friendships with Russia. Some of them go back quite some time. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are countries where Russia has very quietly made some notable economic investments in the past, particularly in the case of Bangladesh in the energy industry. So in that sense, it's not that much of a surprise that some of these countries in South Asia did not want to take the side of the United States and many countries in the West and support that resolution condemning the invasion. So it's quite notable, and for me, I think that's what really strikes me. What's really striking about the South Asian responses to the invasion is it's been very subdued, very muted, and not much more than that. Now, in terms of how the countries in South Asia perceive the likelihood of another or similar conflict in Asia, and in terms of to what extent are countries in South Asia prepared or positioned to respond to such a conflict, I would argue that here, the South Asian countries really step back. I think if we're talking about the possibility of a similar conflict in Asia, it would presumably involve China. Whether we're talking about China and Taiwan, I think that's the main thing that comes to mind. And generally, the South Asian countries are not involved. Certainly, India, which views China as its biggest strategic rival, would certainly be concerned by something like that. But for India, I think the biggest concerns about China are what China might do closer to home, so to speak, closer to India. There had been a pretty nasty and unusually deadly and violent exchange along the border between India and China several years ago. India worries that China is staging increasingly provocative activities along the border targeting India. Those are the things that India worries about. So the notion of China trying to do something in the South China Sea, or trying to do something in Taiwan, it would be concerning to India, but it's not something that India would be in a position or to have the capacity to try to deter. That would certainly fall to the likes of the United States and some of the U.S. treaty partners in East Asia.
Why hasn't India explicitly condemned the war in Ukraine, and what is behind its abstention in the UNSC vote? What do you perceive as driving the strategic calculations behind India's neutrality? And can you discuss some of the challenges of juggling its relationships with Russia, the US, and China?
Yes, so there are 3 main reasons why India has taken the position it has on the invasion of Ukraine. One is that India has a very heavy dependence on Russian arms, and this has been the case for quite some time. For a number of decades, Russia has been India's top arms supplier. And this is particularly important given that India perceives what it would view as a double threat from both China and Pakistan. These are both rivals, enemies of India. and it worries about the threat that they pose. Now, it's ironic that many of the weapons that Russia supplies to India are used by India to strengthen its capacity to deter those threats. And it's ironic because there's been a lot of concern from Washington and some other capitals in the West that India continues to acquire Russian arms, even though India is using those Russian arms in the very way that the U.S. and its partners would like it to strengthen its capacity to deter the threat posed by China. But at any rate, India doesn't want to risk alienating its arms relationship with Russia by condemning the invasion, by condemning Russia. So that's one reason. Second reason why India has taken this position is its broader relationship with Russia. It's a very special relationship. It goes back many years. During the Cold War, India was officially non-aligned, so to speak, but it did have a treaty of friendship that it signed with the Soviets. So it was pretty aligned with the Soviets, even though it was unaligned during the Cold War. And India believes that Russia has really been India's most dependable, most consistent, low maintenance partner. India believes that Russia has gone out of its way to help India on the world stage, including through its voting pattern at the UN, where it has voted on resolutions related to Kashmir, for example, that are in line with what India would like to see. So that's the second reason. The third reason why India has taken this muted position toward Russia is gets more into the strategic aspects of India's foreign policy. India has this policy of strategic autonomy, which is really a modern form of non-alignment. And the idea here is that India wants to maintain as much independence and flexibility as possible in its foreign policy. And for it to have that flexibility and independence in its view, it needs to be careful not to align itself with large blocs, large groups, that it has to not align itself or put itself in certain camps, particularly when it comes to major powers. So in this case, even though you're talking about a cold-blooded invasion, India is unwilling to align itself with those that have been condemning that invasion. The final point, this is nothing new for India. This has always been its policy. It has never condemned Russian aggressions. It has never condemned Russia by name when these aggressions take place. So, the policy is not new, but certainly I think it's more concerning today just because, this aggression is particularly egregious, as well as the fact that India's relations with the U.S. and many other countries in the West, as well as other countries in the Quad, they've all strengthened significantly. So I think the expectations have been higher that India would take a different, more stronger stand against Russia. Not to mention that the United States and other countries who have been the most vociferous opponents of this invasion have really framed the response as something that needs to be done by the world's democracies. That the democracies have to come together and confront Russia and try to do whatever's possible to get it to stop. And India, of course, is the world's largest democracy. So anyway, long answer to a good question. And the short of it is that India has always refrained from criticizing Russia for its aggressions because of its interest, its foreign policy, its relationship with Russia, and its need for Russian arms.
Has the war in Ukraine created new or intensified existing economic and security challenges for India? More generally, has there been any spillover from the conflict in Ukraine into the region? If so, to what extent has it affected regional security and stability?
Yeah, I think that the economic concerns are more stark than security concerns for India and for South Asia emanating from the Ukraine crisis. And I think this is in line with many regions around the world, with the exception of East Asia, South China Sea, where certainly you have to worry about how China may respond, so to speak. We're seeing a series of exogenous shocks to the global economy as a result of the Ukraine crisis. One, of course, being the surging oil prices, the other being food shortages and issues with food supplies. This has impacted India, just like it's impacted many countries in the region. India, like many countries in the region more broadly, had already been dealing with economic challenges due to the pandemic, and the oil prices have caused spikes in inflation that have made things more difficult for India. Though I would argue that India has been more successful than some of the other countries in South Asia, such as Sri Lanka and Pakistan, for that matter, in terms of being able to get the economy back on a bit of a more stable plane. So I think that for India, the biggest concern here, biggest economic concern emanating from the crisis in Ukraine is the rising oil prices and what that means for an Indian economy that is trying to slowly recover from the pandemic. Now, India, of course, because of its special relationship with Russia, it has a way of responding to that many other countries would not have, and that is to simply try to engage more commercially with Russia. And it's made a lot of headlines. As you know, India has decided to scale up its oil imports from Russia. And the Indian government has depicted this as a purely economic decision. Russia was making a lot of cheap oil available, and India wanted to take advantage, which it did. Though I would argue that India and most of the countries of South Asia, for that matter, don't really have major energy relationships with Russia. India gets most of its hydrocarbon imports from the Middle East and increasingly from the United States, interestingly. So in terms of security concerns for South Asian countries emanating from the Ukraine crisis, I think we could agree, the major issue to worry about here is that China could, for whatever reason, be prompted or emboldened or whatever the case may be to cause some really significant worrisome provocations in the South China Sea and conceivably Taiwan. But I don't necessarily think that China would be more inclined to do much in South Asia in a military sense, other than perhaps scaling up provocations along its border with India. But I think that there would be other motivations for that have less to do with Russia and more to do with other things, like India's growing relationship with the United States, for example, or deepening tensions between India and Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, is a close ally of China. So, yeah, I think that the bottom line is that India is sort of a microcosm of the world on the whole, in that it's dealing with a relatively vulnerable economy trying to recover from the pandemic, and so these surging oil prices and rising food insecurity have led to the types of increases in food and fuel costs that the economy really does not need right now.
In your opinion, what were some of the most pressing concerns or topics for discussion going into the Quad summit? Do you think that India's autonomy regarding Ukraine and Russia has or will impact discussions in the future?
Yeah, so certainly the Quad, of course, is this grouping of four Asian countries that have essentially sought to scale up cooperation in order to counter China's rise and power in the region. The Quad, of course, has gained a lot of momentum over the last few years. It's been around for quite some time, but it's only gained momentum in recent years as all four countries have seen their relations with China fall to their lowest level in several decades. I do think that the Ukraine issue is something that has the potential to cause some tensions within the Quad for several reasons. One is that India's position on it is so diametrically opposed to what the other three Quad countries have come out with. Of course, Japan, Australia, and the United States have had some of the most strident, confrontational, critical reactions to the invasion. They've opted for the most harshest form of sanctions and so on, whereas India, of course, has been different. So that's one issue. Second is that we have heard at least one other Quad country, the Japanese Prime Minister, and I know has said this, perhaps others as well, have explicitly linked the Russian invasion of Ukraine to this idea of a free and open rules-based Indo-Pacific. In other words, you've had at least one Quad member say that what has happened in Ukraine is something that we need to do everything possible to make sure cannot happen in the Indo-Pacific, which I would think is referring to the China-Taiwan scenario. But at any rate, the fact that you have a Quad member linking the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the very principles and ideas that drive the Quad itself, this idea of free and open rules-based Indo-Pacific, that's significant given India's position on the Ukraine crisis. And finally, one of the likely geopolitical outcomes from the Ukraine crisis is that Russia and China, which have already seen their relationship grow in recent years, that relationship will get even stronger just because Russia will likely become more dependent on China for economic support, given that it's going to face all these sanctions and could become a global pariah on some levels. So that means that China could enjoy more leverage over Russia, and that could conceivably prompt China to pressure Russia to scale up its presence in the Indo-Pacific. Russia has slowly, in recent years, been trying to scale up relations with some of the ASEAN countries. Not too much, but it's been trying. So given that the Quad is a grouping that is meant to counter China, even if that's never explicitly publicly stated, a China-focused grouping, obviously, if China is getting closer to Russia, then indirectly the Quad is about Russia as well, in my view. Now, all that said, my sense is that the Quad has been able to work around these potential sticking points with India on the Ukraine issue. My sense is that they've agreed to disagree. If you look at the joint statements that have come out of the most recent Quad summits, including the one that just happened this week, you see the same type of language that highlights the few areas where the four countries agree when it comes to Ukraine. There's always a reference, there's a reference to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and how the four countries want to work together to help deal with that. There's also reference to the principles of national sovereignty and territorial integrity and how these cannot be violated. That's basically where the agreements end between the four countries on Russia and on the Ukraine crisis. But the fact is, these joint statements are essentially saying, okay, these are the things we agree on, and now let's focus on all the other unrelated issues that we want to focus on more, and getting to the broader issues associated with the Quad, like the pandemic, with the pandemic vaccine program, cybersecurity cooperation, space cooperation, everything else that goes with it. So my sense is that at the end of the day, it's going to be hard to avoid the Ukraine issue within the Quad, but it is something that the four countries can work around despite India's very different position on it.
When asked whether the US would get involved militarily to defend Taiwan, if it comes to that, President Biden answered yes. Does this have any implications for the strategic ambiguity in the One China policy?
I mean, of course, as you know, it's not the first time that President Biden has made a comment like that. There have been several other times in recent months when he's indicated that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would receive that type of response from the United States. But look, I think that some observers thought that a Biden administration would be much softer on China than the Trump administration was. And yet that clearly has not been the case. I mean, what was one of the very first moves that the Biden administration did? It invited the Taiwanese, the Taiwanese representative in the U.S., so to speak, their ambassador, the de facto ambassador in Washington, to his inauguration. It's the first time that's ever happened. It's the first time a U.S. president has ever invited the Taiwan rep here in D.C. to the inauguration. That certainly sent a really strong message. And then, indeed, we've seen the administration taking a fairly similar position to China that the Trump administration had, a very muscular one. Certainly, the rhetoric has not been as sharp, but this idea of U.S.-China strategic competition being the key priority for U.S. foreign policy, very much there, very much present. So in that sense, what Biden said is not completely surprising, given the trend lines and given what we've seen with this administration and the hard line that it has taken on China. I'm not in a position to say whether Biden, misspoke, though again, this would be a case of him misspeaking several times, because this is not the first time he said this. Makes me think that he really does mean what he said, but maybe, he's talking about something a bit not as much of a change in policy as some might suggest. Perhaps he was really referring to the possibility of the U.S. providing arms support to Taiwan, which still would be potentially a major change in policy. But this could well perhaps also have been an effort on the part of Biden to deter China from thinking about the possibility of invasion by trying to raise the stakes and indicate, well, look at what we could potentially do even if he doesn't really mean it. But I think at the very least, we could read his comments as a reflection of the fact that the administration is very concerned about the very real risk of a possible scenario where China could try to stage military action operations in Taiwan, and also that the larger lesson is there for what it could try to do in the South China Sea as well.
How has the crisis in Ukraine impacted the relationships that have been developing between the EU, US, Asia, and Australia, and their efforts to address China in the Indo-Pacific? Is the emerging transatlantic, trans-Pacific bond a temporary side effect of Russia's invasion or a long-lasting realignment?
Yeah, so I think that the countries and the regions that you mentioned there, certainly I think that there's been this gradual coalescing of interests around the need to work together more to counter the rise of China, particularly because of this shared view that China's actions are increasingly a threat to the security and the interests of these countries. But I would argue that the US and the EU countries and other countries in the West have really faced the same challenge with building a consensus to counter China as they've experienced in trying to build a consensus to counter Russia. And that is the issue of trade, of commercial relationships, particularly in the energy sphere. I mean, as you know, many European countries are heavily reliant on Russian energy and have been slow to embrace the types of harsh, comprehensive, multifaceted sanctions that the US would like to see out there, including those that would target Russia's critical energy sector, particularly its gas industry. And now certainly several of the European countries have talked about new policies they're developing that will allow them to wean themselves off Russian energy supplies. The United States itself has sought to position itself as a player that could be useful in terms of ramping up its own energy supplies. So that's the issue with Russia. With China, it's more broadly speaking the trade relations that China has with so many countries in the West. All four Quad countries, including the United States, have substantive trade relationships with China, though they certainly have been curtailed over the last few years. The Europeans trade very heavily with China. So that's why, and so I think that these are realities that are sort of independent of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think that these would be challenges, regardless of what had happened with that invasion. But certainly, I guess now that we've had the invasion, we've got this stepped up push by the U.S. to try to confront Russia and punish it. Sort of reflects how difficult it is to do that, even if you have these like-minded partners and security allies like some of the NATO countries and even some of the Asian partners, the U.S. treaty allies in Asia. They don't want to completely jeopardize their trade relations with China, and so that certainly is going to cause some issues. And with Russia, these countries, particularly in Europe, are reluctant to risk losing their energy relationships with Russia. And that, of course, redounds to the benefit of Russia and China. It gives them leverage. And, for all this talk of Russia becoming a pariah, I myself had referred to that possibility before. So long as the energy industry in Russia is not fully sanctioned, that's going to give Russia a lifeline, and it'll leverage that and try to provide further inducements to its key energy recipients, including those in Europe, to continue to do business with it. Though, to be sure, the U.S. will be trying to offer its own alternative incentives. We have been talking about Asia broadly speaking in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, President Biden was very recently in Asia. He visited several places, and of course, he was in Japan at the end for the Quad Summit. I think it's notable that when you think about why President Biden is making this trip, especially when he has so much else going on at home and dealing with the Ukraine crisis, why is he making this trip to Asia now? And I think it's important to highlight that the main reason why he is doing this trip, and main reason why he did this trip, was to try to play the role of convincer in chief. Even after all these years of U.S. presidents saying that they are ready to pivot or rebalance, or pick your term, focus more attention on Asia, you still have a lot of skeptical capitals in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, especially in East and Southeast Asia. And so I think it's quite extraordinary that after all those years, there's still that skepticism. And that's the main reason, not the only reason, it's the main reason why President Biden made this trip. Some of his members of his government have it already, but it's important for the president himself to do it. So I think it's important to note that for all this conversation about how the U.S. is strengthening its ties with the Indo-Pacific through the Quad and through strengthening bilateral relationships, some of these countries in Southeast Asia, especially those that have been quietly building up economic relations with China, they're not quite convinced that the U.S. really is ready to complete this pivot, so to speak. And obviously, the Ukraine crisis is now the latest concern because it could be a distraction. So anyway, that's just a final point I'll put out there.